community perception. This is going to be the biggest problem with this announcement from Blizzard, because with Thursday coming, we are getting the raid testing in the beta of The War Within and also Mythic Plus testing. So Blizzard posted an announcement about the various changes coming to the dungeons, from the Heroic Dungeon being the equivalent of a Mythic 0 dungeon, and Mythic 0 now being the equivalent of a +10 dungeon, which is the same as what we have gotten now in Season 4 of Dragonflight. But the biggest set of news was in Mythic Plus, of course. Blizzard is overhauling the affixes in Mythic Plus. They are citing in their explanation wanting to reduce the visual noise, the nameplate clutter. They wanted to minimize the mechanical overlap between the affixes and the dungeon trash. They wanted to make the combat more about, the mechanics of the mobs and the enemies rather than the mechanics of the affixes. So it's all good up to now. They announced they are removing 5 affixes: afflicted, incorporeal, entangling, storming, and volcanic. So 2 affixes are about movement, volcanic for ranged and storming for melee, and then all of the Dragonflight new affixes get removed. So a total L across the board for whoever designed these in Dragonflight, as they get benched immediately in the next expansion. But up to now, it's still very good. It's not that these affixes were particularly liked or enjoyed. The problem is what comes after. The new affixes to take their place in the +4 bucket of affixes, we have Reckless, Thorned, Attuned, and Focused. Now, these all buff trash mobs in different ways. You have 2 affixes that buff trash mobs without mana to do something extra, either to ignore some armor on the tank or to reflect damage whenever you damage them, and then they buff you. Reckless mobs have 30% reduced armor and they take 10% more arcane damage. Thorned mobs take 10% more holy and shadow damage. And then you have Attuned and Focused, which are caster based. Enemies with mana deal more magic damage, but they take more nature damage and damage from bleeds. And then Focused mobs have permanent bloodlust on them, but they take more frost and fire damage. Now, why do I say this is a community perception problem? It's a problem because right now, this is roughly the split of damage you are doing in Mythic Plus. So in Tyrannical, it's close to a 50-50 split on where is your damage going to go in a key, and then in Fortified, it's going to be roughly 2/3 of your damage going into trash mobs. Now, these affixes are further splitting trash mobs into 2 categories: the mobs with no mana and the casters, the ones with mana. This means, for example, that Reckless, which makes you do 10% more arcane damage, it's actually just 4%, because the 10% increased arcane damage is only going to be for about 40% of your damage. Same goes for something like Attuned, where the mob will take 10% more nature damage, but there is only roughly 25% of the damage you're going to be doing in the key on those mobs, so that 10% nature damage is closer to 2.5% damage increase. That's why this will be a community perception problem, because this is not something that will shake the meta up or will randomly make a different spec the meta option week by week, or maybe the spec that can gain the most benefits out of these affixes will become immediately meta. Think, for example, about Havoc Demon Hunter. Havoc deals chaos damage. For those who don't know, chaos damage is practically all of the types of damage combined. So in the Reckless week, where the mobs will take more arcane damage, chaos damage will also benefit from that damage because arcane is part of chaos. And then the week after that, the enemies take more shadow damage. Well, shadow is also part of chaos, therefore chaos is also buffed. So most players have just gotten up in arms complaining about the fact that this will just become very frustrating. Having to be essentially good for 1 week and then having other specs good for 3 weeks until it's your turn again will feel bad. Then it's likely players will also convince themselves their spec is not meta or is not viable because they're not getting buffed enough by these affixes, even though, as mentioned, the actual number, the actual amount of damage you will be doing from these affixes is much smaller than what you see written in the affix itself. It's not 10% more damage, it's closer to 3 to 4% more damage, which is definitely not enough to turn a spec meta out of nowhere, right? But the community perception will have already cast their vote. They don't like it. Just the fact that this is giving damage to a certain spec over a different one arbitrarily week by week won't make players feel good. This is also bad because Blizzard baited people. You read the announcement and you read Blizzard saying, additionally, these affixes will include a positive effect. So you already start thinking about a crit buff, a haste buff, a mastery buff, perhaps more cooldown reduction to your spells, maybe an absorb shield to help with defensiveness, and instead the positive effect you are getting is damage increase to a certain school of damage type that you might or might not have on your character. That does not feel good. What makes this even worse isn't just the affixes that are included, but the combination of the affixes still in the pool. For example, Raging, and then Bolstering, and then Sanguine. These are not very enjoyed affixes. These are also one of the more nerfed affixes over time because of how many problems they tended to create in a key. And yet, even after multiple nerfs, they are still making and still staying in the pool of affixes. So now you might have some combinations, for example, of Focused, where the caster mob has permanent bloodlust while also being enraged during a fortified week. So you will be able to have a focused, raged, fortified trash mob, which will just machine gun cast super fast. And all you are getting for that, all you are getting for having to deal with something like that is 10% more frost and fire damage against that mob, which will benefit practically just a couple of specs. Fire Mage, Frost Mage, Chaos Damage, Demon Hunters, Frost Death Knights, and that's about it. There is also a chance some of these affixes will also make the week by week Mythic Plus keys even more annoying to go through, like for example as a tank, because the first week you have a mob that ignores 20% of your armor, but the next week you have caster mobs with bloodlust. So it might become a need for you, for example, to change your route depending on how dangerous each trash pack can be depending on the week. Also, there is the question mark around Thorned, which is effectively just a damage reflect, so it's only a healer affix. Going down again to one of the many complaints of healers about all of the Mythic Plus affixes in the end turning out to be a healer affix. It just feels like it will be a very toxic environment for the player base. As I said, effectively it's not really going to change much. If, for example, Shadow Priest is meta, Balanced Druid is not going to go over Shadow Priest just because they can do 3.5% more damage to some caster mobs in 1 week. That's not gonna be what makes a certain spec meta. But the optics, the way the community will perceive these arbitrary buffs to certain specs is just gonna cause too much damage. It is just gonna make players frustrated, annoyed, or just disappointed with these affixes. Especially since players have been asking for a while to get some of the buffs back in the affixes, to get some rewards from the affixes, and this is not exactly what players had in mind when they were talking about getting buffed in Mythic Plus. And then this will continue, of course. Players will quickly target some classes for having it better than others. For example, a mage can be good in Focused Week because they can do Frost and Fire damage, and then they can play Arcane during Reckless Week when they can do Arcane damage. Meanwhile, of course, as mentioned, Chaos damage for Demon Hunters is good all the time. Single target Chaos damage for Destruction Warlocks is also good all the times. There are also going to be arbitrary choices within the same class that are better than others. Think about Warrior, for example. During Reckless Week, both warriors get to enjoy doing physical damage to enemies that have reduced armor. However, there is also the Attuned Week, where the enemies take 30% more bleed damage. Fury does no bleed damage, while Arms Warrior has an entire mastery, Deep Wounds, focused around dealing more bleed damage. So Arms Warrior has a practical advantage over Fury Warrior, just because of this. And this I mentioned will not matter in the grand scheme of things, because if Fury Warrior has a better AoE profile for Mythic Plus, which they actually do, then they will still be the better spec than arms. But just the fact that there are affixes arbitrarily buffing certain specs in a week is just going to tick players off. And that's why this feels confusing when Blizzard themselves points this out as if it's a positive. You know, they say we want to highlight different damage types each week, allowing each specialization additional opportunities to excel during the season. That's not the way players will take this. They will take this the annoyed and frustrated way, rather than being excited because in 2 weeks from now my feral druid can do some extra bleed damage. You know, that's not how it's gonna be perceived by the player base. There are some cool ideas behind it, like Blizzard points out, players will have an opportunity to flex towards different talents, gearing options and consumables, right? If it's a week where the mobs take more nature damage and you have, for example, a nature damage trinket, there are going to be nature damage AoE potions you can use, then sure, you know, it's kind of cool that you can do that. But that is related to consumables, to weapon enchants, to trinkets, to flasks, maybe even to weapon effects, etc., but not about different specs entirely. So this entire video is going to be completely pointless in, I think, a few days, at the very worst a couple of weeks. I am going to give you some napkin math and tell you that there is practically 1.6% chance that these affixes make it to live, as they are right now. So yes, we have pointed out the problems with them right now and why are they bad, but don't expect these to go on for too long, because I feel like even from just the initial reaction from the player base, these will not live for long. So with this recap about these Mythic Plus affixes done on this Tuesday, it's now time to leave each other. We are saying our goodbyes while also pointing out that you can still support completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, okay, I didn't take too much to make the video, not as long as I thought, only about a couple of hours.